Hello, Body and Massage. Today we're going to cover the last part and the final part of Lesson 9 of TBON, where we acknowledge the atrocities of the Black Holocaust. We're going to cover today the time period between 1965 until the present year of 2020. We're going to show you guys how there are atrocities that continue to happen. It didn't just end with civil rights and the civil rights struggle. We continue to war against the spirit of white supremacy and fight against that. And there are still people who are literally have lost and continue to lose their lives in this battle. I want you guys to go back if you have not already, because I know I mentioned it in the last part of lesson 9. Go back and look at COOH lesson 6 part 4. COOH lesson 6 part 4. In the last 10 minutes of that lesson, Surgical Bible Study reveals the link in between Baal worship and white supremacy. Now, Baal worship goes from eons and eons ago, from the Egyptian kingdom, Babylonian, Medo-Persian, Greek, Roman kingdom, Roman Catholicism, all the way it can be traced down to the Ku Klux Klan. And you will see elements of Baal worship there. Now, there are different aspects of Baal worship. Baal worship, you can bond with Baal through sexual immorality, and that's revealed in Numbers chapter 24, 25, when the children of Israel were hit with a plague because they engaged in sexual immorality that caused them to bond with Baal. But Surgical Bible Study reveals how white supremacy is another aspect of causing people to be bonded with Baal. When you look back at, I think they have photographs that are out there of some lynchings that have taken place. You will see the people sitting around this lynching, this murder happening, and they're having a picnic, or they're celebrating, or they're smiling and wanting to be caught in a photo with this particular type of atrocity occurring. And with that, you have a demonic spirit of supremacy that is attached to it and is passed down. When you look at COOH, lesson 6, part 4, the last 10 minutes, we reveal that to you. Now, I want you to be hopeful. I want you to also, in a part of breaking a spirit of oppression, go back and look at BRR, Biblical Racial Reconciliation, lesson 5, in part 1. And we talk about the spirit of oppression and how it is passed down through time, through different things that happened and occurred during slavery. Now we look at these police shootings that are occurring, and a lot of the offenders or people who have murdered Black and brown people walk free. In that lesson, in Biblical Racial Reconciliation, lesson 5, I draw the correlation between the fact that the police was founded on subjugating and capturing and brutalizing slaves in order to keep the slave population in control. So you still have some elements of that mentality and that demonic spirit that is carried down even through law enforcement. It's carried down through all aspects of society, from banking institutions, from the government, politics, law enforcement, school, system practices. So all forms of injustice against God's chosen people. This is something that's ongoing. I'm sorry about it inside. But we look here, and as we cover this time period from 1965 until now, it is started off and kicked off with a lot of violence on a political front. So we have people who are still have this attachment to this demonic, satanic spirit of supremacy, who want to hold on to that, and they don't want to let go. And they're ingrained in all fibers of society. And as they're warring against this and not wanting to let this go, you have all this violence that is broken out against people who are fighting for the civil rights of Black people. Excuse me. So we see here in the 1960s, it's kicked off with the assassination of John Kennedy in 1963. There's the assassination of Malcolm X in 1965. The assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. in 1968, and John's brother, Robert Kennedy, was assassinated also in 1968. And these atrocities are because they are warring against those who, like I said, are bonding with this spirit, wanting to hold on to this spirit of supremacy. We have to break that. We have to fight against that. And acknowledging the atrocities of the Black Holocaust will allow us to do that. There are people out there who talk about the current protests uh, for Black lives, and it's also a continuation of the civil rights struggle for the rights of Black people. You see people aligning with political parties and getting hostile on each side, and God is not pleased with that. Neither side. There is no political group that is going to help the body of Messiah, nor the children of the Most High God. Ultimately, government systems, period, are going to come against the body of Messiah and the children of the Most High God. So we have to be fully aware and cautious of that. But one thing that we have to do is hold on to God's standards of justice and abide by them. Now, for those of you who sit there and go, well, this stuff can be resolved by politics. No, you have systemic racism occurring. And not only in 1965, when you have the civil rights struggle in order to attain voter rights for Black people, you have people whose lives were threatened. Some people died because they were simply registering people to vote. And this spirit has carried down throughout time, even into the 1980s. And it still has its little ugly head rearing now in 2020. I'm going to share a couple of articles with you to reveal to you how this spirit is evil, even trying to continue in present day time. Okay, these two articles I'm sharing with you. The first one is on pbs.org. The title of it is, I'm sorry, I apologize. This article, the first article, was by the New York Times. And the New York Times wrote an article that's titled, "The Voter Fraud Case Jeff Sessions Lost and Can't Escape." It's written by a person named Emily Brazelon. And it was published on January 9th, 2017. Then we have the next particular headline or topic that is covered on a YouTube channel called Willie D Live. And he covers the subject that's titled, "Houston Voted in 19 Black Women Judges. Now the Texas governor wants to change the Constitution." This was published on August 19th of 2020. So you still have people who are intertwined and want to hold on to this demonic spirit of white supremacy that is fighting against, even at a political level, against the Black and brown Hebrews, and against people who are trying to fight for the rights of them to be placed in office. It keeps rearing its ugly head. But inside, we have to make sure which team we're on. Whether or not you choose to engage in politics or not, God is going to overturn all of the systemic racism and things that are ingrained and strongholds that are trying to stand up against his chosen people, who the majority are Black and brown Hebrews. Now, when we go over here and we look at the continued inequalities that happen against Black people, we are going to cover three topics here: the justice system, murders that are passed off as suicides, and financial discrimination. Now, in this first one that we cover, I'm going to give you a way to go and research these different topics and the atrocities that continue in further detail. For example, in this first one, we have the 13th Amendment. The 13th Amendment is a way in which the government, the US government, is legitimizing continued slavery. And the continued slavery against God's people, Black people, by mass incarceration. Look up a movie by Ava DuVernay a sister named Ava DuVernay, and that she produced, and it's called 13th, and it's about the 13th Amendment. You can probably find it on Netflix and download it. And she peels back these layers of how this amendment continues slavery. We have the false arrest of Black people at heightened levels throughout the 1960s, even to present day time. An example in 1965 is a man named Reuben Hurricane Carter. He is a boxer. And this boxer was, him and his friend were falsely accused of a triple homicide in New Jersey. They were placed in prison. Probably 11 years after that, there's this group. I believe they're part of the Innocence Project. This Innocence Project is a group of a multinational crew of people who fight against injustices as far as convictions that were given and handed down against people who were clearly innocent. And they worked over the years to overturn thousands and thousands of cases. And in the case of Mr. Reuben Carter, he was in prison. They retried the case in 1976. It was not overturned, but his conviction was finally overturned in 1985. And by that time, he had spent 20 years in prison. This is something that is not specific to the South or the North or the East. It's happened throughout the U.S. You have high numbers of mass incarceration and false arrest against Black people in states like Pennsylvania. Of course, I mentioned New Jersey, New York. You have cities like Chicago where, wow, the distrust is so high against the police because they perpetrated these crimes, spiritual crimes, and also physical crimes against the Black population. That keeps happening. An example of current day false arrests, if you look back at a documentary that was covered of a young man named Khalif Browder. He was falsely imprisoned as a teenager. I think he was like 19 years old. And he had to stay in prison for about 3 years because his mom was too poor to afford the bail. The bail was like $1,000 or less. And you have people like Jay-Z, our Hebrew brothers like them, and celebrities, other Black celebrities that are trying to overturn and provide relief for all of these people, poor white people and Black and brown people who cannot simply afford bail because they're too poor. And they're raising monies and they're bailing these people out so that they'll have a chance to fight against the injustice that has occurred against them. You have a false arrest that occurred, very most popular one that a lot of people know about because there was a documentary to cover it, was the Central Park Five. See, the criminal justice system is very high against accusations against Black and brown children. They're criminalized at much higher rates. You have teenage children that are young as 13, that have been criminalized and given life sentence for various stuff. If you look at the documentary of the Central Park Five, they were 5 teenage kids, and they were convicted of some heinous crime of attempted murder and raping this white woman jogger. And come to find out, they were all had been brutalized, and some were forced into making false confessions. And it's very sad because it traumatized them and was carried on for years of their life. They had to struggle after they got out of prison, and these convictions were overturned. These are continued atrocities against God's chosen people. We have murders that are passed off as suicide. These murders happen throughout history. In the 1960s, like I said, it wasn't blatant lynchings that occurred that were out in the open. You still have people who were intertwined with white supremacist organizations who carried this spirit of white supremacy, who still would do things behind so-called closed doors. I remember in the small town that I'm from, country town that I'm from, some of our Black citizens had police radios because they wanted to hear what's going on with the police, who they're pulling over and arresting, because sometimes the Black men would end up so-called committing suicide. Mind you, they were just only arrested for a so-called traffic violation like a bus tail light or something like that. And they get a simple ticket, and they want us to believe that them getting a simple ticket and having to maybe stay in jail overnight, one night, they committed suicide. We in the Black community know that this is passed down through history, that they were murdered, their lives were taken. And we can fast forward all the way to now, to present day time, where we see people like Sandra Bland, who had no reason to be placed in jail. Yes, she was cursing the officer out and angry and upset, but the fact of the matter is there was no reason for her to be placed in jail. There was no reason for her at all. They kept trying to figure out to place some type of charges against her. And this is not right. But they want us, Black people who have lived through all these atrocities, to believe that she climbed up in the rafters with some raggedy, cheap jail garbage bag, trash bag, and tied it up to the rafters and hung herself. No, she was murdered, and we pretty much know that. This is well known in the Black community and has passed down through histories where murders happen and they are passed off as suicide. I'm going to share a couple of articles with you to reveal this fact that even the FBI knows that a lot of white supremacists have infiltrated law enforcement. Like I said, they're in all aspects of society, but they know beyond a shadow of doubt that they have infiltrated law enforcement. So it's up to individual judges, police officers that who are followers of the Most High God to do what's right and call that out. Then also call their fellow officer, or judges, or whoever, or lawyers out on these situations. Because these atrocities are occurring, like I say, over and over again against God's people. You have activists who are participated in protests against the police violence that has happened. They're turning up dead, or their family members are turning up dead. In Ferguson, Missouri, there are activists there, I think it's about 5, that have mysteriously turned it up dead. One activist, her son, ended up hung in her backyard in a tree with his pants pulled down. Come on now. You got 2 separate incidents of activists who are in a car who have gotten shot up and then the car set on fire. We in the Black community knows that this is coming from white supremacist soldiers, race soldiers, and it's coming from this demonic spirit of white supremacy, them trying to hold on to some type of power that they're never going to be able to reign supreme and have power over, because God said so. Now let me share these 2 articles with you. So here, the first article. This article is written on pbs.org, the PBS News Hour. And the title of this article is FBI Warned of White Supremacists in Law Enforcement 10 years ago. Has anything changed? The person who wrote this article is named Kenya Downs. And this article was published on October 21st, 2016. The next article is on a site called gen.medium.com. And the title of this article says, 5 years after Ferguson, a spate of dead activists fuel distrust and division. This article was written by Josh Sandburn, and it was written on August 8th, 2019. So this shows you by the inside the intensity of the struggle that continues. It didn't end with civil rights, it continues. You can go on your own and look up articles about mysterious hangings, which were deemed as suicides, that have occurred in Mississippi, California, Texas, Atlanta, Georgia. You have Black men and women who are being found hung in trees. You have the Mexican citizens, Spanish citizens, who are also found being hung in trees. Look up articles just in this past year of the ones in the past 2 years, and you will find this. We know these things are not suicide. We know in the Black community where they came from. So, Body of Messiah, stay woke. Be very diligent about staying woke about the things that are occurring around us in our environment. When we look at the the next situation here is the financial discrimination. Financial discrimination, you may say, hey, that's not murders or atrocities. But yes, they contribute to the oppression of God's chosen people. You have financial and banking institutions where the government itself is engaged in discriminating intentionally against Black people, where they said Black people are not allowed to get home loans. They're not to get allowed to get low interest home loans. There's redlining. There are situations where the government said you cannot loan to Black people in order for them to establish a home and live in certain areas. And this has happened over and over in time, and it's carried down through the banking institution discrimination. You might have heard of discriminatory acts happening against Black people with J.P. Morgan and Chase. You have these different banking institutions where this is being revealed out in the open, where Black people, Black men, Hebrew men, like ex-NFL football players or those who have come by their financial means outside of sports because of their background in a business that they've started, being discriminated against even when they have a truckload of money to invest. So this continues and it traumatizes our population. You'll see where even school funding, you'll notice that in 1965, there was desegregation. The schools were integrated. Do you know in present day time, they're showing where the schools are just as segregated as they were back in 1965. This is intentional because of that spirit of white supremacy that individual people ingrained in the school zoning system and government are trying to keep busing Black and brown children to one school system and keeping the white population, trying to keep it as the majority in another schooling system. My children have had experienced this where we're getting bused all the way, dozens of miles, 17, 20 miles away from an area where they're passing like 5 or 6 schools just to be bused at a school that's predominantly Black. But I'm totally cool with that. Look, these things that Satan is doing, that Satan means for bad, God means for good. God is overturning all of these actions that are trying to embolden white supremacy, and God is tearing them down. He's tearing them down before our eyes. For those of us who are woke, we can see it happen. For those who are not, then hey, they're still going to be in the valley of confusion. But I want you to be understanding that later on when I cover these scriptures, you should not be confused about. We have insurance. The insurance industry has engaged in trying to oppress and mistreat Black people. Throughout, I've had this happen within my family where people have paid on policies for years and years and they wanted to cash them out, or an incident has happened and they're wanting to file a claim. And they were being discouraged because they were like, no, you don't have the correct policy or you don't have these benefits. And they come forth and show the paperwork. And some, they've had to go to case, threaten to go to trial in order for them to get their benefits. But you have this happening back in the day where Black people were totally being rejected to have insurance. If they had a house and they lived in a well-to-do neighborhood, their houses usually mysteriously ended up getting burnt down or something or violated. And so they were not allowed to have insurance in order to pay for it to be rebuilt, or there was an excuse given. You have, even today, Black and brown people who are living in those more expensive neighborhoods, and they're finding that they're being charged a lot more than their white neighbors for the same insurance coverage. God is not pleased with this, and God is dealing with this. You wonder why this country in the United States, one side is on fire and the other side is trying to stay floating above water with all these multiple hurricanes that are coming back to back to back. There's a reason for that, body and side. We have to make a decision of what team we're on. Are we going to be on team Most High God, or are we going to be following the doctrines of man? Now, through the doctrines of man, there's this big divide dealing with politics now, because this is a year in which people are going to engage in voting in our society here in the U.S. And they are cleaving more to politics than they are to God on both sides. They're finding reasons to try and hate one another and be bitter at one another. But they're missing the whole point of the fact that God is crying out to them to do justice by the poor, the needy, the fatherless, and the widows. And of course, the outsiders within the gate. And of course, to do justice towards his people, his chosen people. Now, if you don't want to deal with all that, I want you to wake up now, because you have to make a choice. If you continue in a system that engages in systematic oppression, God is judging you and going to judge you. God is saying that he's going to overturn these things that are suppressing and oppressing his people. When you read Isaiah chapter 42 and 43, God is very well aware. When you look at Isaiah chapter 42, verse 22, he's very aware that Jacob, Israel, the descendants of Israel, have been given over to the looters, those who are robbing them of money and robbing them of financial stability and wealth. He is aware of the fact that the majority of them are cast off. They're in prisons. This is his descendants, his chosen people. But when you continue to read, he's saying, and this is regardless of politics, this is regardless of whether or not the whole nation as a whole decide to do right by them, God is going to overturn all of that and bring these systems down to naught. He's doing that because his word is true. He's going to say, give them back. He's going to call them out of captivity. Those who have placed them in captivity, he's going to place in captivity. So you can decide to do what you want, but my advice to you is you either love the black and brown Hebrews or leave them alone. Love us or leave us alone, because you don't want to be on the wrong side of judgment. In Genesis chapter 12, verse 3, pastors and rabbis are infamous for using this to say, those who bless Israel will be blessed and those who curse Israel will be cursed. That is true. But in this scripture, he's specifically telling, Adonai Elohim is telling Patriarch Abraham, I want to bless those who bless you and curse those who curse you. So if you're blessing his descendants and his chosen people, you are blessing Patriarch Abraham. But if you're cursing and you're warring against them, then you're going to be cursed. In Jeremiah chapter 30, verse 16, Adonai says to the children of Israel, yet all who devour you will be devoured, and all your foes, yes, all of them will go into captivity. These plundering you will be plundered, and all preying on you I give as prey. In Deuteronomy chapter 30, verse 7, as the descendants of Israel are turning their hearts back to the Most High God, to worship him wholeheartedly, back to his commands and his statutes, he says, Adonai your God will put all these curses on your enemies and on those who hate you, who persecute you. It's so clear cut, body and the side. So choose and make your election sure. Stop standing by the wayside when people are sitting here and they're cleaving to politics, government, fraternal orders more than God's word. Call them out on that, because you have to do right and abide by that. if you want to be an honorable member of the body of Messiah and to be covered by his peace. 2 Timothy chapter 3, verse 1 through 9. Read that on your own time. And he's telling us right now that we're living in the latter days and these things are occurring. There is a reason why this plague of the coronavirus has caused congregations to be broken down to the stubs, all the way down to the foundation, because God wants us to return to the foundation. He wants the religious leaders to return back to the whole truth of his word. Stop going about your merry way and thinking that, oh, it's okay if I continue in this pattern of prosperity doctrine, or glorifying and bragging on, or asking for jet airplanes when members in your congregations are poor. They can't even pay a light bill or a water bill. Okay? Return back to your first love and abide by the basic standards that God is telling us to abide by. He does not want congregations to continue business as usual because they are wrapped up in the doctrines of man. People can't even embrace the fact that, like I said, when you look at the Bible series, The Why, that the majority of the household of Israel are black and brown people, because they're holding on so tightly to the doctrines of man. And it's causing the body of Messiah to be cast in confusion as we look at these latter day prophecies that involve the household of Israel, the Israel that God has ordained, the Israel that God says he's going to bring out of captivity, the Israel that God says he's going to gather from the four corners of the earth. Do right by it, body of Messiah. In 2 Timothy, Adonai said, but understand this, that in the last days hard times will come. For people will be lovers of self, lovers of money, boastful, arrogant, hard-hearted, hating what is good, conceited. Avoid these people. I'm going to take it even further. Probe your spirit, evaluate yourself. Make sure that you don't carry these characteristics yourself. Avoid that at all costs and depart from it. God is talking about in the latter days through Rabbi Shaul. He's saying that there will be ministers to slip into the household and deceive weak women. We see this, that weak-minded women are being deceived by wholeheartedly placing their trust in a religious leader more than God. They've been deceived into committing adultery or sinful acts, even being deceived into trusting a person so much that they've given their children over to the hands of people who have abused their children. God warned of this in the latter days. God is saying that this generation is always learning, yet never able to come to the knowledge of truth. God expects us to face his truth. And a part of his truth is acknowledging the atrocities of the Black Holocaust. Never forget, so we won't repeat that history. Well, Body of Messiah, this is the end of lesson 9, and I'm so glad you were able to join me. I think I'm going to begin to cover things that involve prophecy, since we're living so close to things that are unfolding so fast that deals with the truth of God's word and the prophetic things that are unfolding right now. Our eyes have to continue to be open and alert and watchful. Thank you so much for joining me. And as I always say to you, may Adonai Elohim cover you, shower you, shield and protect you, and surround you with his shalom peace. Goodbye.